This is the last call for Jaunt 701. The pleasant female voice echoed through the blue concourse of New York's Port Authority Terminal. The PAT had not changed much in the last 300 years or so. It was still grungy and a little frightening, and the automated female voice was probably the most pleasant thing about it. This is Jaunt service to Whitehead City, Mars. All ticketed passengers should now be in the blue concourse sleep lounge. Make sure your validation papers are in order, and thank you. The upstairs lounge was not at all grungy. It was wall-to-wall carpeted in oyster gray, and the walls were an eggshell white and hung with pleasant non-representational prints. A steady, soothing progression of colors met and swirled on the ceiling. There were 500 couches in a large room, neatly spaced in rows of 10. And 5 Jaunt attendants circulated, speaking in low, cherry voices and offering glasses of milk. At one side of the room was the entranceway, flanked by armed guards and another Jaunt attendant, who was checking the validation papers of a latecomer, a harried-looking businessman with the New York World Times folded under one of his arms. And directly opposite, the floor dropped away in a trough about 5 feet wide and perhaps 10 feet long. It passed through a doorless opening and looked a bit like a child's slide. The Oates family lay side by side on 4 Jaunt couches near the far end of the room. Mark Oates and his wife Marilyn, flanked by 2 children.
Daddy, will you tell me about the Jaunt now?
Ricky asked.
You promised. Yeah, Dad, you promised,
Patricia added. A businessman with a build like a bull glanced over at them and went back to the fodder of papers he was examining as he lay on his back, his spit-shine shoes neatly together. And everywhere came the low murmur of conversation and the rustle of passengers settling down on the Jaunt couches. Mark glanced over at Marilyn Oates and winked. She winked back, but she was almost as nervous as Patty sounded, and why not? First Jaunt for all 3 of them it was. He and Merrill's had discussed the advantages and drawbacks of moving the whole family for the last 6 months, since he'd gotten the notification that Texaco water had been transferred to Whitehead City, Mars. And finally, they had decided that all of them would go for the 2 years Mark would be stationed on Mars. He wondered now, looking at Marilee's face, if she was regretting the decision, and he glanced at his watch and saw it was almost half an hour to Jaunt time. There was enough time to tell the story, and he supposed it would take the kids' minds off their nervousness. Who knew? Maybe it would even cool Marilee's out a little. "All right," he said. Ricky and Pat were watching him seriously, his son 12, his daughter 9. And he told himself again that Ricky would be deep in the swamp of puberty and his daughter would likely be developing by the time they got back to Earth, and again found it difficult to believe. The kids would be going to the tiny Whitehead Combine School with 100-odd engineering and oil company brats that were there. His son might well be going on a geology field trip to Phobos, not so many months distant from now. It was difficult to believe, but true. Who knows? Maybe it'll do something about my Jaunt jumps too. So far as we know, he began to tell the kids, the Jaunt was invented about 325 years ago, around the year 1987, by a fellow named Victor Caroon. And he did it as part of a private research project that was funded by some government money. And eventually the government took it over, of course. And in the end, it came down to either the government or the oil companies. The reason we don't know the exact date is because Karun was something of an, eccentric.
You mean he was crazy, Dad? Eccentric means a little bit crazy, dear.
Marilise said, and smiled across the children and Mark. She looked a little less nervous now.
Oh.
Anyway, he'd been experimenting with the process for quite some time before he informed the government of what he had. And he only told them because he was running out of money. They weren't going to refund him.
Your money cheerfully refunded,
Pat said and giggled. That's right, honey, Mark said and ruffled her hair gently. At the far end of the room, he saw a door slide noiselessly open. 2 more attendants came out, dressed in the bright red jumpers of the Jaunt service, pushing a rolling table. On it was a stainless steel nozzle attached to a rubber hose beneath the table's skirts, tastefully hidden, and Mark knew there were 2 bottles of gas. In the net bag hooked to the side were 100 disposable masks. Mark went on talking, not wanting his people to see the representative of life until they had to. And if he was given enough time to tell the whole story, they would welcome the gas passers with open arms. Of course, you know that the jaunt is teleportation, no more, no less. And sometimes in college chemistry and physics they call it the Karun process, but really it's teleportation. And it was Karun himself, if you believe the stories, who named it the Jaunt. He was a science fiction reader, and there's a story by a man named Alfred Bester. The Star's My Destination, or something it's called. And this fellow Bester made up the word jaunt for teleportation. Except in his book, you could jaunt just by thinking about it, and, well, we can't really do that. The attendants were fixing a mask to the steel nozzle and handing it to an elderly woman at the far end of the room. She took it, inhaled once, and fell quiet and limp on her couch. Her shirt had been pulled up a little, revealing one slack thigh road mapped with varicose veins. And attendants considerately readjusted for her, while the others pulled off the used mask and affixed a fresh one. It was a process that made Mark think of the plastic glasses in motel rooms. He wished to God that Patty would cool out a little bit. He had seen children who had to be held down, and sometimes they screamed as the rubber mask covered their face. It was not an abnormal reaction in a child, he supposed, but it was nasty to watch. He didn't want to see it happen to Patty. About Rick, he felt much more confident. I guess you could say that Jaunt came along at the last possible moment. The world was running out of oil, and people were committed to using it as a political weapon. They had formed an oil cartel they called OPEC.
What's a cartel, Daddy?
Well, it's like a monopoly.
Like a club, honey. And you could only be in that club if you had lots of oil. Oh, okay.
Well, I don't have time to sketch out the whole mess for you. You'll study some of it in school, but it was a mess. Let's let it go at that. If you owned a car, you could only drive it 2 days a week, and gasoline cost 15 old bucks a gallon.
Gosh, Ricky said. It only costs 4 cents or so a gallon now, doesn't it, Dad?
That's why we're going where we're going, Rick. There's enough oil on Mars to last almost 8,000 years, and enough on Venus to last 20,000. But oil isn't even important anymore. Now what we need most of all, water, Patty cried. And the businessman looked up from his papers and smiled at her for a moment. That's right, because in the years between 1960 and 2030, we poisoned most of ours. The first water lift from the Martian ice caps was called
Operation Straw.
That was Ricky. Yes, in 2045 or thereabouts. But long before that, the Jaunt was being used to find sources of clean water here on Earth. And now, water is our major Martian export. The oil's strictly a sideline, but it was important then. The point is, those things were always there, but we were only able to get it because of the Jaunt. And when Karun invented his process, the world was slipping into a dark age. The winter before, over 10,000 people frozen to death in the United States alone because there wasn't enough energy to heat them.
Oh, yuck,
Patty said. Mark glanced to his right and saw the attendant, to a timid-looking man, persuading him. At last he took the mask, seemed to fall dead on his couch seconds later. First-timer, Mark thought. You can always tell. For Karun, it started with a pencil, some keys, a wristwatch, and some mice. The mice showed him there was a little bit of a problem. Victor Karun came back to his laboratory in a stumbling fever of excitement. He thought he knew how Morse had felt, and Alexander Graham Bell and Edison, but this was bigger than all of them. And twice he had almost wrecked a truck on the way from the pet shop in New Paltz, where he had spent his last $20 on 9 white mice. What he had left in the world was 93 cents in his right front pocket and the $18 in his saving account. But this did not occur to him, and if it had, it certainly would not have bothered him. The lab was in a renovated barn at the end of a mile-long dirt road on Route 26. It was making the turn onto this road where he had just missed cracking up his brat pickup truck for the second time. The gas tank was almost empty, and there would be no more than 10 days to 2 weeks, but this did not concern him either. His mind was in a delirious whirl. What happened was not totally unexpected, no. One of the reasons the government had funded him, even to the paltry tune of $20,000 a year, was because the unrealized possibility they had been there in the field of a particular transmission. But to have it happen this suddenly, with no warning, and powered by less electricity than was needed to run a color TV. As he was setting the ion gun in place, his fingers had slipped through the portal a little. Ordinarily, no problem. But this morning, his hip had also brushed the toggle switch on the control panel at the left of the portal. He was not aware of what had happened. The machinery gave off the lowest audible hum until he felt a tingling sensation in his fingers.
What was it, Daddy?
Ricky said.
Yeah, what?
Patty added. Mark grinned. They were all hooked now. Even Mary Lee. They had nearly forgotten where they were. And from the corner of his eye, he could see the Jaunt attendants whisper, wheeling their carts slowly among the Jaunters, putting them to sleep. It was never as rapid a process in the civilian sector as it was in the military. Civilians got nervous. They wanted to talk it over. The nozzle and the rubber mask were too reminiscent of hospital operating rooms, where the surgeon with his knives lurked somewhere behind the anesthetist, with her selection of gases and stainless steel canisters. And sometimes there was panic, hysteria, and always there were a few who simply lost their nerve. Mark had observed the two of these as he spoke to the children, 2 men who had simply arisen from their couches, walked across the entranceway with no fanfare at all, unpinned the validation papers that were affixed to their lapels, turned them in and exited without looking back. Jaunt attendants were under strict instructions not to argue with those who left. There was always standbys, sometimes as many as 40, 50 of them, hoping against hope, as those simply couldn't take it left, and standbys were let in with their own validations pinned to their shirts. Karun found 2 splinters in his index finger. He took them out and put them aside. One was lost, but you can see the other in the Smithsonian Annex in Washington. It's in a hermetically sealed glass case near the moon rocks the first space travelers brought back from the moon.
Our moon, Dad, or
One from Mars, Ricky asked. Ours. Only one manned rocket flight has ever landed on Mars, Ricky. That was a French expedition, somewhere around 2030. Anyway, that's why there happens to be plain old splinters from an orange crate in the Smithsonian Institution. Because it's the first object that we have that was actually teleported or jaunted across space.
what happened then?
Karun ran back to Portal 1 and stood there for a moment, heart thudding out of breath. Got to calm down, he told himself. Got to think about this. You can't maximize your time if you go half-cocked, deliberately disregarding the forefront of his mind, which was screaming at him to hurry and do something. But he dug his nail clippers out of his pocket and used the point of file to dig the splinters out of his index finger. He dropped them onto the white inner sleeve of a Hershey's bar he had eaten while tinkering with the transformers and tried to widen its afferent capabilities. He had apparently succeeded in that beyond his wildest dreams. One rolled off the wrapper, lost. The other ended up in the Smithsonian Institution, locked in a glass case that was cordoned off with thick velvet ropes and watched vigilantly and eternally by a computer-monitored closed-circuit TV camera. The splinter extraction finished, Karun felt a little calmer. A pencil. That was as good as anything. He took one from the bedside of the clipboard on the shelf above him and ran it gently into Portal 1. It disappeared, smoothly, inch by inch, like something in an optical illusion or in a very good magician's trick. The pencil had said Eberhard Faber, number 2, on one of its sides, black letters stamped on yellow painted wood. When he had pushed the pencil in, till about all but the Eber had disappeared, Karun walked around to the other side of Portal 1. And he looked in. He saw the pencil in cut-off view, as if a knife had chopped it smoothly through. And Karun felt his fingers where the rest of the pencil should have been. And of course, there was nothing. And he ran across the barn to Portal 2, and there was the missing part of the pencil, lying on top of the crate. And heart thumping so hard that it seemed to shake his entire chest, Karun grasped the sharpened point of his pencil and pulled it the rest of the way through. The key went through next. Karun simply tossed them through the portal. He was beginning to think on track again now, and it seemed to him that the first thing that needed finding out was if the process produced things on the other end and exactly as they had been, or if they were in any way changed by the trip. He saw the keys go through next and disappear. At exactly the same moment, he heard them jingle on the crate in the barn. He ran across, really only trotting now, and on the way he paused to shove the lead shower curtain back on his track. He didn't need either it or the ion gun now, just as well, since the ion gun was smashed beyond repair, and he grabbed the keys, went to lock the government, had forced him to put on the door, and tried the Yale key. It worked perfectly. Tried the house key. It also worked. So did the keys which opened his file cabinets, and one which started the Brat pickup. Karun pocketed the keys and took off his watch. He ran across and grabbed it. When he put it through, the watch had said 11:31:07, and now it said 11:31:49. Very good. Right on the money. Only he should have had an assistant over there to peg the fact that there had been no time gained once and forever. But No matter, kids. Soon the government would have him wading his deep in assistance, and he tried the calculator. 2 and 2 still made 4, 8 divided by 4 was still 2. The square root of 11 was still 3.3166247, and so on. That was when he decided it was mouse time.
What happened with the mice, Dad?
Mark hesitated briefly. There would have to be some caution here. If he didn't want to scare his children, not to mention his wife, the major thing was to leave them with the knowledge that everything was all right now, that the problem had been licked. As I said, there was a slight problem. Karun set the box, which read, "I came from Stackpole's House of Pets," down on the shelf and glanced at his watch. He turned it around and saw that it was 1:45. He had only an hour and a quarter of computer time left. How time flies when you're having fun, he thought, giggled wildly. Karun screamed and ran back to the box of mice. He was just in time to knock 2 potential escapees back in the box. He got a second mouse, holding this one around the body, which he was, by trade, a physicist, and the ways of white mice were foreign to him, and slammed the lid of the box back down. This one he gave the old heave-ho. It clutched Karun's palm, but to no avail. It went head over ratty little paws through Portal 1. Karun heard it immediately land on the crates across the barn. This time he sprinted, remembering how easily the first mouse had eluded him. He need not have worried. The white mouse was merely crouched on the crates, its eyes a little dull, its sides aspirating weakly, and Karun slowed down and approached it carefully. He was not a man used to fooling with mice, but he didn't have to be a 40-year-old veteran to see something was terribly wrong here. The mouse didn't feel so good. Karun touched the mouse. It was like touching something inert, packed straw or sawdust perhaps, except for the aspirating sides. The mouse did not look around at Karun. It stared straight ahead. He had thrown in a squirming, very frisky, alive little animal, and here was something that seemed to be a living, waxwork likeness of a mouse. And then Karun snapped his fingers in front of the mouse's small pink eyes, and it blinked, and it fell dead on its side. Karun ran back to the barn. The mouse was DOA. There was no blood, no bodily swelling to indicate that a radical change in pressure had ruptured something inside, and Karun supposed that oxygen starvation might. He shook his head impatiently. It took the white mouse only nanoseconds to go through. His own watch confirmed that time remained a constant in the process. The second white mouse joined the first in the paper sack. Karun got a third, a fourth. He held this one firmly across the body and forced its haunches through the portal. Across the room, he saw the haunches reappear, just the haunches. And the disembodied little feet were digging frantically up the rough wood of the crate. And Karun pulled the mouse back. No catatonia here. It bit the webbing between his thumbs and forefinger hard enough to bring blood. And Karun dropped the mouse hurriedly back into the "I came from the Stackpole's House of Pet" box, and used a small box of hydrogen peroxide. He put a Band-Aid over it, then rummaged around until he found a pair of heavy work gloves. He could feel the time running out. It was 2:11 now. Karun pulled the mouse out by the snout, not liking the feel of it, and dropped it into the paper sack with its companions. Enough with the white mice, he decided. The mice die. They die if you put them through all the way, and they die if you put them through halfway head first. Put them through halfway butt first, and they stay a little frisky. So frisky they stay alive. Sensory input, he thought randomly. When they go through, they see something, hear something, touch something. God, maybe even smell something that literally kills them. What? He had no idea, but he meant to find out. And Karun still had almost 40 minutes before Comlink pulled the database out from under him. He unscrewed the thermometer from the wall beside his kitchen door, trotted back to the barn with it, and put it through the portals. This thermostat went in at 83 degrees Fahrenheit, came out at 83 degrees Fahrenheit. And he rummaged through the spare room where he kept a few toys to amuse his grandchildren. And among them, he found a packet of balloons. He blew one of them up, tied it off, and batted it through the portal. It came out intact, unharmed. A start down the road toward answering his question about a sudden change in pressure, somehow caused by what he was already thinking of as jaunting. With 5 minutes to go before the witching hour, he ran into his house, snatched up his goldfish bowl. Inside, Percy and Patrick switched their tails and darted about. He shoved the goldfish bowl through Portal 1 and hurried across to Portal 2, where his goldfish bowl sat on the crate. Patrick was floating belly up. Percy swam slowly around near the bottom of the bowl as if dazed. A moment later, he also floated belly up. Karun was reaching for the goldfish bowl when Percy gave a weak flick of his tail and resumed his lackadaisical swimming. And slowly, he seemed to throw off whatever the effect had been. And by the time Karun got back to Mosconi's veterinary clinic that night at 9 o'clock, Percy seemed as Percy as ever. Karun fed Percy a double ration of fish food, and he gave Patrick a hero's burial in the garden. And after the computer cut him off that day, Karun decided to hitch a ride over to Mosconi's, and accordingly, he was standing on the shoulder of Route 26 at 3:45 that afternoon, dressed in jeans and a loud plaid sports coat, his thumb out, a paper bag in his other hand. Finally, a kid driving a Chevette not much bigger than a sardine came and pulled over. Karun got in. "What you got in the bag, my man?" "Bunch of dead mice," Karun said. Eventually, another car stopped, and when the farmer behind the wheel asked about the bag, Karun told him it was just a couple of sandwiches. Mosconi dissected one of the mice on the spot, and agreed to dissect the others last and call Karun on the telephone with the results. The initial result was not very encouraging. So far as Mosconi could tell, the mouse he had opened up was perfectly healthy, except for the fact that it was dead. Victor Karun was an eccentric, but he was no fool, Mark said. The Jaunt attendants were getting close now, and he supposed he would have to hurry up or he would be finishing this up in the wake room at Whitehead City. So we got a ride back to his home that night. He had to walk most of the way, the story goes, and he realized that he had maybe solved a third of the energy crisis at one single stroke. All the goods had to go by train, truck, and boat, and plane before that day they could be jaunted. You could write a letter to your friend in London, or Rome, or Senegal. And you could have it there the very next day, without an ounce of oil needing to be burned. Yes, we take it for granted, but it was a big thing to Karun, believe me, and to everyone else as well. What happened to the mice, Daddy? Well, that's what Karun kept asking himself, because he realized that if people could use the Jaunt, that would solve almost all of the energy crisis, that we might be able to conquer space. In his Popular Mechanics article, he said that even the stars could finally be opened, and the metaphor he used was crossing a shallow stream without getting your shoes wet. The solar system, the entire galaxy like a stream.
I don't get that at all, Patty said. That's because you got a turkey for brains, Ricky said smugly. I do not. Daddy, Ricky said children don't, Marilee said.
Well, to get back to the story, Karun pretty much foresaw what has happened. Drone rocket ships programmed to land, first on the moon, then on Mars, then on Venus, and the outer moons of Jupiter. Drones really only programmed to do one thing after they landed: set up a jaunt station for astronauts. That's right, Ricky. And now there are scientific outposts all over the solar system. And maybe someday, long after we're gone, there will be another planet for us. There are jaunt ships on their way to 4 different star systems now. But it'll be a long time. A long, long time before they get there.
But I want to know what happened to the mice,
Patty said. Well, eventually the government got into it. Karun kept them out as long as he could, but finally they got wind of it and landed on him with both feet. And Karun was nominal head of the Jaunt project until he died 10 years later. But he was never really in charge of it again.
Oh, jeez, poor guy, Ricky said. But he got to be a hero, Patricia said. He's in all the history books, just like Lincoln and President Hart.
I'm sure that's a great comfort to him, wherever he is. They wanted the jaunt on a paying basis as soon as possible, like yesterday. And faced with economic chaos and the increasingly probable picture of anarchy and mass starvation, only the last-ditch pleading made them put off announcements of the jaunt before an exhaustive spectrographic analysis of jaunted articles could be completed. And when the analysis were complete and showed no changes in the makeup of jaunted artifacts, the existence of the jaunt was announced with international hoopla. Showing intelligence for once, necessity is, after all, the mother of invention, the U.S. government put Young and Rubicam in charge of the PR. That was where the myth-making around Victor Karun, an elderly, rather peculiar man who showered perhaps twice a week and changed his clothes only when he thought of it, began. Young and Rubicam, and the agencies which followed them, turned Karun into a combination of Thomas Edison, Eli Whitney, Pecos Bill, and Flash Gordon. And the blackly funny part about all this, and Mark Oates made sure not to pass this on to his family, was that Victor Karun might even then have been dead or insane. Art imitates life, as they say, and Karun would have been familiar with a Robert Heinlein novel about the devils who stand in for figures in the public eye. And Victor Karun was a problem, a nagging problem that wouldn't go away. He was a loud-mouthed foot dragger, a holdover from the ecological 60s, a time when there was still enough energy floating around to allow foot dragging as a luxury. Victor Karun remained a problem, and then he became a rubber stamp, smiling, quiet, grandfatherly, a figure seen waving from podiums and news films. And 3 years before he officially died, he rode in a pace car to Tournament of Roses. Puzzling, and a little ominous. The results of the announcement of the jaunt, of working teleportation, was a hammer stroke of worldwide excitement and economic upheaval. On the world money markets, the battered old American dollar suddenly skyrocketed through the roof. People who had bought gold at $806 an ounce suddenly found that a pound of gold would bring them something less than $1,200. In the years between the announcement of the jaunt and the first working jaunt stations in New York and LA, the stock market climbed a little over 1,000 points. The price of oil dropped only 70 cents a barrel. with Jaunt stations crisscrossing the U.S. at pressure points of 70 major cities.
But what about the mice, Daddy? What happened to the mice?
Mark decided it might be okay now, and he drew the attention of his children to the Jaunt attendants, who were passing gas out only 3 aisles from them. Rick only nodded, but Patty looked troubled as the lady with a fashionably shaved and painted head took a whiff from the rubber mask and fell instantly unconscious.
You can't jaunt when you're awake. Can you, Dad?
Ricky said. Mark nodded and smiled reassuringly. Karoon understood even before the government got into it.
And how did the government get into it, Mark?
Marilise asked. Mark smiled. Computer time. The database. That was the only thing that Karoon couldn't beg, borrow, or steal. The computer handled the actual particulate transmission. Billions of pieces of information. It's still in the computer, you know. To make sure you don't come through with your head somewhere in the middle of your stomach. Oh, don't be frightened. There's never been a mess-up like that. Never.
There's always a first time.
Mark looked at Ricky.
How did he know? How did Karoon know you had to be asleep? When he put the mice in backwards, they were all right. At least as long as he didn't pull them all the way. They were only, well, messed up when he put them in head first, right?
Right, Mark said. And the Jaunt attendants were moving in now, wheeling their silent cart of oblivion. He wasn't going to have to finish, after all. Perhaps it was just as well. It didn't take many experiments to clarify what was happening, of course. The Jaunt killed the entire trucking business, kids, but at least it took the pressure off the experimenters. Yes, foot dragging had become a luxury again, you see, and the tests had gone on for better than 20 years, although Karoon's first tests with drugged mice had convinced them that unconscious animals were not subject to what was known forever as the organic effect, or simply the Jaunt effect. You see, he and Moscone had drugged several mice, put them through the portal, retrieved them on the other side, and waited anxiously for their test subjects to reawaken or to die. And they had reawakened, and after a brief recovery period, they had taken up their mouse lives, eating, playing, no ill effects whatsoever. And those mice became the first of several generations which were studied with great interest.
When did they start with people, Dad?
Rick asked, although they had certainly read it in school.
Tell that part. I just want to know what happened to the mice,
Patty said again, although the Jaunt attendants had now reached the head of their aisle. They themselves were near the foot. Mark Oates paused a moment to reflect. His daughter, who knew less, had nevertheless insisted to her heart and asked the right question. And therefore, it was his sons he chose to answer. The first human jaunters had not been astronauts or test pilots. They were convict volunteers who had not even been screened with any particular interest in their psychological stability. In fact, it was the view of the scientists now in charge, Karoon not one of them, that the freakier they were, the better. If a mental head case could go through and come out, all right, no worse than they had been going in. Probably safe for executives, politicians, fashion models all over the world. And half a dozen of these volunteers were brought to Provence, Vermont, a site which had previously been famous for Kitty Hawk. And they were gassed, fed through the portal exactly 2 hand miles apart, one by one. And Mark did tell his children this, because of course all 6 of the volunteers came back just fine, feeling perky. But he did not tell them about the purported 7th volunteer. This figure, who might have been real or a myth, or most probably a combination of the two. He even had a name, Ruddy Foggia. Foggia was supposed to have been a convicted murderer, sentenced to death in the state of Florida for the murder of 4 old people at a Sarasota bridge party. And according to the Apocrypha, the combined forces of the Central Intelligence Agency and the FBI had come to Foggia with a unique, one-time, take-it-or-leave-it, absolutely not to be repeated offer. Take the jaunt wide awake. Come through okay and we put you on pardon. Signed by Governor Thorogood. Out you walk, free to follow the one true cross. Or off, a few more old folks playing bridge in their yellow pants and white shoes. Come through dead or insane. That's tough stuff. Foggia, who understood that Florida was one of the states that really meant the business about the death penalty, and whose lawyer had told him that he was in all probability the next ride to old Sparky, said okay. Enough scientists to fill a jury box. 4 or 5 left over as alternatives were present on that great day. But if the Foggia story was true, and Mark Oates believed it probably was, he doubted it had been any of the scientists who talked. More likely, it had been one of the guards who'd flown with Foggia from Railwood to Montpelier, and then escorted from Montpelier to Provence in an armored truck. The thing is, he came through alive, but Foggia was in no condition to eat his chicken dinner. In the space it took to jaunt across 2 miles, perhaps 0.00006 seconds on a computer, Foggia's hair had turned white, snow white. His face hadn't changed in any physical way. It was not lined or jowly or wasted, but it gave the impression of a great, almost incredible age. And Foggia shuffled out of the portal, his eyes bulging blankly, his mouth twitching, his hands splayed out in front of him, and he began to drool. And the scientists who had gathered around drew away from him. And though Mark really doubted if any of them had talked, they knew about the rats after all, and the guinea pigs and the hamsters. What happened? It was the only question Foggia had a chance to answer. And what he said was, it's eternity in there. An awful dying declaration. It's eternity in there.
Daddy, I want to know what happened to the mice.
The only reason she had a chance to ask again was because the man in the expensive suit and the Eterna Shine shoes had developed into something of a problem for the jaunt attendants. He didn't really want to take the gas, and he was disguising it with a lot of bluff, bully boy talk, and the attendants were doing their job as well as they could, smiling, cajoling, persuading, but it had slowed them down. Mark sighed. He had opened the subject only as a way of distracting his children from pre-jaunt festivities, it was true. But he had opened it. And now he supposed he would have to close it. This had raised a terrible specter. Well, even now, no one really knows, Patty. But all the experiments with animals, including the mice, seem to lead to the conclusion that while the jaunt is almost instantaneously physical,
It takes a long, long time mentally. I don't get it. I knew I wouldn't. But Ricky was looking at his father thoughtfully. They went on thinking, the test animals, and so would we if we didn't. Now, something was dawning in Ricky's eyes. Fright, excitement. It isn't just teleportation, is it, Dad? It's some kind of time warp. In a way. That's a comic book phrase. It sounds good, but it doesn't really mean anything, Rick. It seems to revolve around the idea of consciousness. What he meant to say was your mind can be your best friend. It can keep you amused even when there's nothing to read, nothing to do. But it can turn on you when it's left with no input for too long. It can turn on you, which means that it turns on itself, savages itself, perhaps consumes itself, an unthinkable act of auto-cannibalism. How long in there in terms of years? 100 years, 1,000, a million, a billion? How long alone with your thoughts in an endless field of white? Then a billion eternities have passed. Ricky. Excuse me, are you ready? One of the Jaunt people asked. Daddy, I'm scared. Will it hurt? Said Patty. Oh, honey, of course it won't hurt. I'll go first. You'll see how easy it is. And the Jaunt attendant looked at him questioningly. And Mark nodded and made a smile. The mask descended, and Mark took it into his own hands and breathed deep of the dark. And the first thing he became aware of was the hard black Martian sky seen through the top of a dome which surrounded Whitehead City. It was night here, and the stars sprawled with a fiery brilliance undreamed of on Earth. And the second thing he became aware of was some sort of disturbance, and the recovery room mutters, then shouts, and then a shrill scream. Oh dear God, that's Mary Lee's. Bright red jumpers flying around. Mary Lee staggered toward him, pointing. She screamed again, and then collapsed on the floor, seeing an unoccupied Jaunt couch rolling slowly down the aisle with one weakly clutching hand. But Mark had already followed the direction of her pointing finger. He had seen it. It hadn't been fright in Ricky's eyes, it had been excitement. And he should have known, because it was Ricky. Ricky, who had fallen out of the highest crotch of the tree in their backyard in Schenectady when he was only 7, who had broken his arm and was lucky that it had been all he broke. And Ricky, who dared to go faster and further on his slide board than any other kid in the neighborhood. Ricky, who was the first to take any dare. Ricky and fear were not well acquainted. Until now. And beside Ricky, his sister still mercifully slept. And the thing that had been his son bounced and writhed on his Jaunt couch. A 12-year-old boy with snow-white fall of hair and eyes that were incredibly ancient. The corneas gone sickly yellow. He was a creature older than time, masquerading as a boy, and yet it bounced and writhed with a kind of horrid, obscene glee. And it choked. Lunatic cackles the Jaunt attendants drew back in terror. Some of them fled, although they had been trained to cope with such an unthinkable eventuality. The old young legs twitched and quivered, claw hands beat and twisted and danced in the air. Abruptly they descended, and the thing that had been his son began to claw at its face. Longer than you think, Dad! Longer than you think, Dad! Held my breath when they gave me gas, wanted to see, and I saw longer than you think. Longer than you think, Dad! And it said other things. Before the Jaunt attendants were finally able to bear it away, rolling its couch swiftly away,
as it screamed and clawed at the eyes that had seen the unseeable forever. And it said other things, and then it began to scream. But Mark Oates didn't hear it, because by then he was screaming himself.